Good morning, and thank you for joining Hudson Institute for what promises to be a very informative discussion. My name is Dan Battier, and I'm an adjunct fellow at Hudson. Economic growth in Latin America has lagged behind every other region in the world, averaging only about 1% annually over the last decade. And productivity has been a big factor in this. Many explanations have been offered for why productivity in Latin America is so low. A recent article in The Economist pointed to informality and corruption and low education standards. The World Bank has carried out some outstanding and innovative work providing a more complete and nuanced understanding of the productivity challenge in the region. Crucially, the World Bank's most recent research has focused on two underlying problems which are at the root of the productivity challenge. The first of these is the competitive landscape in Latin America, which has broad impacts on investment and productivity and on consumer welfare. The second is one that has been largely overlooked over the years, and that is the economic performance of Latin America's cities. To lay all this out for us, I am pleased to welcome Bill Maloney and Elena Yanchevicina. Bill Maloney is Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Elena Yanchevicina is Lead Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Bill, I'd like to start with you. What is new or noteworthy in the World Bank's most recent economic forecasts for the region?
First of all, thanks very much, Dan, for the invitation. These are topics that are incredibly important to us in the region since, as you mentioned, we haven't grown as a region, and the type of problems we're facing, whether they be productivity or organized crime, are only seeming to get more intense over time. Recently, on the growth front, if you want to talk about that, we remain low. There's been a bit of an upward revision of our forecasts in the last couple of months, but we remain low. We're still below overall 2% for the region as a whole. Our forecasts going forward are sort of 2.5%, and the problem with that is it's not enough to promote social mobility or reduce poverty, and it's not a temporary thing. If you look at the decade of the 2010s, we were also growing about 2.2% when the rest of the world was growing at about 3.1%. So we have structural issues here, which we need to deal with on the growth front. This said, it is very important to highlight that this is not your grandfather's hyper-volatile inflationary region. COVID marked the second major crisis when we didn't do particularly worse than anybody else. It used to be we'd say the United States would get a cold and Latin America would get pneumonia. Everybody got pneumonia this last time, and we didn't do much worse. And the second thing is if you just look at inflation, taking out a couple problem children, our inflation rates are below those of the OECD. And both of those factors testify to an overall better macroeconomic management, a professionalization of ministries of finance and central banks, which has given us a much more stable macro environment to work in. So we're kind of in a situation of mediocre growth, but a fair amount of resilience on the macro front.
Elena, can you talk a little bit more about the consequences of this economic picture? What does it mean for Latin America's future?
That's a very important question, because we know that sustained economic growth is crucial for development. In an environment of low economic growth, labor incomes stagnate, job creation is limited, and it is difficult to find better jobs that pay more. So countries that are stuck in a low growth equilibrium have difficulty making progress with poverty reduction, difficulty reducing unemployment, underemployment, and informality. And they also have difficulty responding to crises, economic crisis, pandemics, and natural disasters, and most importantly, to provide quality public goods to improve the well-being of their citizens and the living standards. For example, many countries have underinvested, where growth is lacking, have underinvested in health and education, and in infrastructure, and in social protection. So these countries actually experience also rising levels of social polarization and social unrest and political instability.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty important to have a good, healthy growth trajectory.
Thank you. Yeah, Bill, your research on competition underscores the high degree of concentration that we see in Latin America's economies. Can you talk about this and explain why it matters and what are the impacts of this?
So why do we care about competition? Well, the same debate, of course, has gone on in the United States for many years. But competition, first of all, is a kind of disciplining device. It keeps our firms on their toes. It's an incentive, in theory, to innovation. It also weeds out firms which, over the longer run, are lower productivity and helps transfer their resources or allows those resources to be available for more productive firms. It allows us access to higher quality and lower cost inputs for productivity, and that increases productivity. And it's important to remember that on the consumption side, it lowers the costs of consumer goods, the consumer basket, for all those in the society. So particularly in Latin America, it lowers the cost of the basic basket of goods that the poor consume. So for all those reasons, the issue of competition is very important. I think the things that we found that were novel in the report were, first of all, that Latin American competition authorities that work to increase competition in the region among firms within the countries had a uniformly positive effect. That's to say that when they brought antitrust suits or the like, or any kind of suit that tried to limit anti-competitive behavior, you found productivity going up, you found sales going up, you found wages going up. So it's an overall positive scene. The only issue there is these agencies in the region tend to be underfunded and lack independence. It's very hard to take on the really big gorillas because the gorillas have friends in higher places. So that was a major finding. I think the other finding was that international competition becomes a little bit more complicated because if your firms are not able to compete with the best of the firms in the international market, then they will find it hard to innovate their way out of that competition, and they're likely to be hurt. And we've seen that in many sectors in Latin America, too.
You make the case that there's a whole series of policies and institutions that you need to have in place to really have healthy competition. Can you talk a little bit more about how governments should be thinking about that, and is there a particular sequence or priority that governments should think about in terms of creating a more competitive environment?
Right. So we have often focused mostly on the competition agencies themselves or on international competition, and what the report argues is you need to be looking at the entire ecosystem that these firms are working in. Mm-hmm. For instance, when I say firms that are close to the technological frontier or close to the managerial frontier are able to innovate to escape competition, that's more than just saying that they've got the right scientists. That means they've got world-class management that brings them close to the frontier. That means they're working in an environment where they can get the financing, where it's easy to do business, where you can import the goods you need, so there's more or less open trade regime, where there's not a lot of macro or political instability. All these things are kind of necessary for firms to actually get close to the frontier and be sophisticated firms that can compete. And so you need to have both these two sides going at the same time. If we don't have competition, that we wind up in the world of the United States in the 70s with bad cars. And if you have only competition without these other factors that help firms get closer to the technological frontier, then you won't get the desirable impacts on innovation that you want.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Elena, I want to switch gears and talk about the role of cities. What led you to begin to focus on the role of cities in productivity?
Yes, so that's actually a very interesting question, because if you don't have this geographic perspective, it offers very valuable insights that we can't obtain from studies or from analysis that are standard aggregate ways of looking at the economy. Mm-hmm. The spatial lens allows us to see that it is important to take into account the spatial unevenness of economic activity and resources, including human resources, labor, and the persistence of this unevenness over time. So once you look at that, then the interesting insights appear. And with the geographic lens, what we are able to focus on are factors that limit the mobility of goods and people from one area to another, and also those factors that depress and weaken urban productivity growth. Previous studies have rarely focused on these issues in the context of growth in the region, yet they play an important role in keeping aggregate growth down in Latin America, as we show in our most recent Latin American flagship report on the evolving geography of productivity and employment. So with that perspective, what we identify are three factors that weaken urban productivity and the gains from agglomeration in cities. Given the basically they're important to look at because 4 out of 5 people in Latin America live in urban areas. So we have a predominantly urban workforce. And so it is important that this workforce is located in places that are vibrant and dynamic. And we identified 3 structural and intertwined factors that matter. And we refer to them as the 3 Ds. The deindustrialization of employment in cities, the high costs of distance between cities, and divisions within cities. And so I'll take a couple of minutes to explain why each of these factors matter for economic growth. So the first one, the deindustrialization of employment, affected cities of all sizes in the region, but was particularly severe and pronounced in the largest ones, and that there is research supporting that. So as manufacturing employment declined in cities, the composition of employment shifted towards less dynamic, low productivity, non-tradable services, and these activities do not benefit from dynamic gains through international trade or endogenous innovation. They offer lower wages and returns to experience. And they also, we show in the report, gain less from agglomeration economies than urban tradables, especially when the firms offering these services are located in very congested cities. Congestion is very harmful, more harmful to these activities. The second factor, the second D, the distance, the high cost of distance, especially the very high intercity transport costs, are problematic because they harm the performance of the network of cities by limiting market access, limiting knowledge spillovers, and importantly, hurting firms who might want to relocate and specialize in smaller urban centers that are less costly, so allowing them to realize savings. One of the reasons we show in the report for these high costs is the insufficient and poorly allocated investment in road improvements, because most of the transport in the region occurs by road, not by rail. And another one, which matters more in some of the countries in our region, is the limited competition in the transport sector. And there are studies now trying to look at that. The third factor is the divisions. Latin American cities are divided and congested. They're segregated into into relatively distant and poorly connected low-income and high-income sections. And in this type of cities, the knowledge flows, information flows are restricted, but also the benefits from agglomeration are limited to neighborhoods that are located close or nearby the central business districts, and where formal firms operate and amenities are abundant. However, residents of poor neighborhoods are often trapped in informality. They often suffer multiple deprivations, as we show in the last chapter of the report. And in these places where there are scarce amenities and also deficient public services. So what we have in the cities of our region is the existence of a dual economy, a formal one, a modern one, which flourishes in the central business districts, and an informal one, in the low-income neighborhoods. And this coexistence creates a spatial misallocation because informal transactions which occur in the low-income economy do not generate tax revenue. And the fact that this happens in many, or if not most, of cities in the region suggests that the cities that are supposed to be the engines of growth are underperforming, and that affects aggregate growth.
Mm-hmm. What are the key recommendations for policymakers that come out of your research?
Well, the report actually is usefully shows that one needs to look at the entirety of issues to see what the problem is, because we show that over the past 2 decades, the region's model of resource-dependent growth actually delivered convergence in productivity, labor productivity, and place productivity in all countries at the second municipal administrative level, and at the first administrative level, which means the state or the province in most economies. At least for the countries we have information, and we have information on quite a few presented in the report. Yet, this resource-driven model of development delivered only a very short-lived pickup acceleration in growth during the golden decade. And once the decade was over, growth fell down to levels observed to the low levels of the past. So the convergence reduced territorial inequality because urban productivity fell behind the productivity growth in the poorer rural, agricultural, and mining areas, many of which benefited from investments and the high demand for commodities from China, and other fast-growing emerging economies. However, cities at the same time struggled to perform. And so policymakers in the region need to transition or blend this resource-driven model with one that better utilizes the workforce, the urban workforce. And to be successful in doing that, there is a need not only to improve urban productivity, but to improve the efficiency with which countries in the region transform natural wealth into human capital, infrastructure, and good institutions. And so successful transition to this two-pronged model of development would require that countries overcome challenges at 3 geographic scales: the national, the regional, and the local. And at the national level, we have a very wide-ranging agenda, and Bill already mentioned the importance of macroeconomic management, which has improved, competition, the overall business environment, so I'm not going to repeat what he said, and we can return to that later. But the point of the report is that this will not be sufficient. Nationwide policies improving them will help a lot, but not really boost because the growth to the extent that it's possible because of deficiencies at the regional and local level. So briefly, to outline at the regional level, countries need to improve the investments made to strengthen connectivity between cities within countries and across countries to stimulate domestic and regional trade, and allow opportunities for specialization not only within countries but between countries, so that they trade more and realize savings, and improve also the digital connectivity. When we look at the report, we find that improving access to affordable and quality internet services has been relatively slow compared to Europe, Eastern Europe, and other places in emerging markets. So, and it's particularly problematic that also there is unevenness geographically, and some communities are left behind. So we find that the poor and rural communities are particularly unable to connect, basically, the way they should to benefit from formal opportunities in the formal economy. And at the local level, what we find is that Policymakers need to improve the competitiveness and livability of cities, particularly intercity connectivity to connect these poor and richer parts to enable people that are stuck in the informal economy now to benefit more from opportunities that open up in the formal economy eventually as growth picks up. And also to, in a few countries actually in the region, although territorial inequality we show declined, in a few countries it still remains high. Mm-hmm. So these countries need to remove restrictions that allow people to move from the low-income remote areas where they're found right now to opportunities in urban areas in other places. And these countries are Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, as well as Panama, actually.
Okay, thank you. Bill, your report touches on the potential of nearshoring, and you find that by and large, you're not really seeing that much new investment that is not related to energy. Can you talk a little bit more about your findings regarding nearshoring and what you recommend for countries to make that a reality?
So, in theory, this should be a moment, a great opportunity for Latin America in the sense that wages broadly seen in, for instance, Mexico and Brazil are below those in China at this point, or not, or in the same area more or less. We know that the last 3 years showed us how fragile our value chains are, so there's a desire to have greater duplication and more robustness in our supply system. And we also know that the geopolitical realities have dictated a desire to have more parts of the value chains closer to home, or at least in, closer to home measured in various different ways. The data to date are sending very mixed signals. If you talk to people working in the north of Mexico, there's a lot of demand for industrial parks, a lot of interest in foreign companies. However, if you look at the aggregate data on foreign direct investment flows to Latin America in general and even to Mexico, they're actually below where they were in real terms 12 years ago. And if you look at greenfield announcements, this is actually new investment, not reinvesting profits from existing firms, which is a good chunk of that FDI number. We don't see very much at all. And it's not uniform. In Costa Rica, for instance, is a $1.6 billion investment by Intel. That shows up in the data quite. The movement of medical device companies to Costa Rica and to some degree to Dominican Republic. That's all there. But in the big countries, you're not seeing big investments in, for instance, manufacturing sectors. We have to keep looking at the data to try to understand what's going on there. Because on the one hand, you've got that aggregate data, then you've got the reports on the ground from the north of Mexico. But then you can also say, well, so if real estate is so scarce, why aren't banks massively investing in that? And the banks right now are a little bit reluctant. They're waiting and seeing as well. This is a tremendous opportunity. And if the data is correct, then there are a lot of questions we have to be asking. Why, if wages are not so out of line now and distances, obviously we're much closer, why are we not seeing more? And I think there are a number of factors that, to take advantage of this opportunity, we need to work on. And there are things like the kinds of things that Elena pointed to. Transport is difficult. Infrastructure is difficult. We have these geographical segmentation, which is kind of hard to take advantage of a lot of things. We have a problem with the quality of our workforce in general. That shows up among Latin American countries in general. About 30% of firms say they can't grow because of a lack of qualified workforce. That's a problem for foreign direct investors too. The level of violence in our region is a barrier we need to work on. And we need to, above all, I would say, maintain the rules of the game so that foreign direct investors can take a long-term horizon and say, okay, I'm going to be here 30 years. I'm going to move my operation from Shanghai to Monterrey or to Colombia or wherever it's going to be, and I'm going to know that it's okay. It doesn't mean we have to have everything perfect in terms of our business climate. We need to work on that uniformly in our countries. But if you look at the Chinese business climate, it was not clean. It was not World Bank doing business spick and span, but you need to have agencies that help you navigate that as well. And so there's a bunch of work to do. Again, I think it's a big opportunity, but we have to make it work.
Okay. Elena, I want to pick up on your comments about informality. You underscore how essentially you have dual economies developing where the formal and informal economies are sort of cut off from each other. Are there besides creating stronger infrastructure that would connect informal workers with the formal economy, are there other policies that you would suggest to address informality?
Yes, actually we have the informality expert in Latin America sitting next to me. Bill has done a lot of work on the topic, but from the lens of the spatial lens that we look at, I think that there is a need to not only better connect the poor and low-income parts where informality thrives, but to get into these neighborhoods and provide services that would encourage the emergence of a formal sector there itself. Because what we know now is that it's sort of like a mini informal economy thriving there to satisfy the needs of the low-income population there. And we know that they don't travel for shopping, even for work, to the formal parts. When we look at Mexico City, for example, we have detailed surveys of travel within the city. And we see that this is a structural issue. It's not just sprinkled everywhere. It is concentrated, and therefore targeted policies within these sections should be also used.
Yeah,
to address this problem.
Bill, would you like to add anything on that?
So I think Elena's analysis adds a really interesting new dimension to the debate around informality, because it talks about the geographical segmentation of the modern and the more traditional economy. We have to combine that with work that we've been doing at the bank for 10 years, which shows that even though that geographical segmentation exists, there's still a huge amount of ping-ponging between the two sectors. Workers are in the formal sector for a while, and they become informal, and vice versa. It's a very dynamic process. So the traditional view of these very segmented markets where you come in as an informal worker, you get a formal job, and then you die as a formal worker, that is not the correct model. And it's also not quite the correct model that you have all these firms that would like to become formal, but they just can't register or whatever. That also is not a correct discussion. So at the end of the day, what we have, and gets back to what Elena was talking about, is we need to both really increase the productivity of the formal sector, of the modern sector, and make it more attractive as a place to be rather than running your own business and not being very linked with the state. Because as Elena points out, you're geographically segmented, the state doesn't do that much for you anyway, why would I become formal? But what we need to do is both increase the productivity in the modern sector, but also reduce the distance, both physically, but also in terms of what the state does for you, and your relationship with the state, to make formality more interesting.
Yeah. One of the things I find striking about the report on competition is the extent to which you have cartels in nearly every sector of the economy in much of Latin America, and it's notable how much this affects basic consumption, basic goods that people rely on. Is there any recommendations you have regarding, perhaps prioritizing competition in areas where you have impacts on people's ability to people's livelihoods?
Well, I think again, what was very novel about the work behind that report, and also report that's forthcoming, which is a more complete treatment of competition in the next couple of months, is how important these competition authorities are in the region. Because in the areas where they go after, they identify a cartel and they take action, you see precisely falls in prices, increase in sales, increase in productivity, and even increases in wages. So it's like everything good comes together with that. And so what we just need is, one thing we need is clearly a more energetic, better financed, more independent competition authorities. But just to say one thing that also came out a little bit, which is we tend to think that if we just have free trade, lower tariffs, that will discipline local prices. That effect is a little bit less strong than we thought. And I'll just give you one example, which is a couple months ago, there was maybe a little bit more than a couple months ago, there was a toilet paper price fixing scandal in Chile, right? It's like the two largest producers of toilet paper were fixing prices. And so you could say, well, we can import toilet paper from everywhere. They can import Charmin, they can import whatever, but clearly that wasn't enough to discipline that behavior. So that's another argument for why you need to have these local competition authorities with some muscle.
Thank you. Elena, your research identifies significant barriers to migration within countries, and whereas historically cities have served as sort of a magnet for workers looking for better opportunities, you find that it is very difficult in much of Latin America for workers to make their way to cities where there are opportunities. How do you see that playing out in the region? Are there ways to lower those barriers so that people can make it to where there's economic opportunity?
Yes, the picture on the ability of people to benefit from relocating from rural to urban areas is quite interesting because the region is very urbanized. So we have had a lot of movements to cities in the past. And what we see right now is that the main movement and people who can benefit from such moves are people living in smaller cities or in rural areas that are skilled, and then they can go and find good jobs in cities. However, we now have cities having a very large number of poor people. So, in fact, studies have shown that the inequality, spatial inequality, mainly stems from inequality within municipalities, not so much across municipalities within countries. And so cities are quite unequal, not only divided and segregated, but there is high inequality in many of the largest cities in the region. And so the main problem from domestic migration point of view is that the cities don't offer sufficient opportunities for making it worthwhile for people who are poor and unskilled to make a living make a better living in cities. And this is because we already have a sort of congestion or too many unskilled people in the region. And that's why the deindustrialization of employment plays an important role, because before rural residents could migrate to cities close by their villages, or they could go farther, and usually they went farther because they could get a manufacturing job without much education. But now these jobs are increasingly scarcer because we know that from the reports that we have done, there are other studies that our office has done that show that while there is deindustrialization of employment, actually the value added contributed by the manufacturing sector hasn't fallen down. There are factories in Brazil and other places that are very automated, so they're labor-saving technologies which have reduced the need to hire workers. And so there is a challenge then, and overall an agenda, which Bill also referred to, that has to do with improving the quality of education so that people who grow up in smaller urban areas or rural urban areas are prepared, if they wish so, to move to something better in the city rather than just relocating.
Yeah. Okay.
If I could just double down on this.
Sure.
If you look at PISA scores, the mathematics achievement scores in Latin America, and you compare them to Asia, they're about 100 points lower in Latin America than they are in Asia, right? So when corporate companies are going around the world looking for places to land, the workforce is going to be more able to handle new technologies if it's, this is 100 points on like a 500 or 600 point scale. It is a lot. So we have a major agenda in the region in improving the quality of public education in every dimension. Mm-hmm. It's also important because that's where we draw entrepreneurs from. To some degree, economic growth is a function of the density of entrepreneurial activity. And if you've got 80% of your workforce that is not able to read or manage basic numeracy, then okay, you really shut down the pool of entrepreneurs that you've got. Mm.
On the surface, it would seem that these two areas of research are quite different, but there are some sort of common themes. Can you talk about either of you, talk about the complementarity between these two ways of looking at productivity?
Well, they're all part of the same elephant. Mm-hmm. So when I was talking about the need for complementary reforms to ensure the positive impact of increased competition, that gets into a lot of the things that Elena's talking about. To get firms near the technological frontier where they can compete globally, you need to have well-functioning cities. You need to have transport networks that make it so they can get their products to the coast in a reasonable amount. You need to have well-functioning ports. You need to, all those things are part of the ecosystem in which firms grow and which presumably get their productivity to the point where they can compete. So there's a huge overlap of agendas mm-hmm. there. I think what Elena's report is bringing to bear is that something we haven't focused on enough is that it's necessary to look at a subnational level and to look at the various different levels of geographical disaggregation, reveal other issues we have to work on in order to increase productivity. I'll let you follow up from there.
No, Bill said it very well, and indeed, if there is one thing to emphasize, and it relates not only to what he said right now, but also to the improving opportunities for offshoring in the region, is that it is crucial from a growth perspective and from a development perspective in Latin America to strengthen the competitiveness of urban tradables, mm-hmm. so that they are able to create the jobs needed in cities where we also have a lot of the poor. So we talked about migration from other areas in these countries, but we already have a pool of people in the low-income parts of cities that are underemployed, that are struggling, that are employed in the informal economy in very low productivity activities. And so the competitiveness agenda is crucial in depleting this pool of surplus labor that may be there, because then we have problems. We have crime, we have issues that are created, mm-hmm. polarization, that also creates a sort of a vicious spiral of low growth, more polarization, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And this needs attention. So mm-hmm. these two reports and all the reports that actually the Bill has done and our colleagues in the past have done are pointing to various aspects of this growth puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you see this agenda making any headway in the region? What kind of responses are you getting from policymakers on your recommendations?
Actually, it's interesting because I presented various elements of both reports in the region, and both get a lot of attraction. So mm-hmm. Chile was, for instance, very interested in the spatial issues and the issues of spatial integration and how that might be affecting productivity. And the competition agenda, I was actually surprised. I thought we would get a little more pushback on that. But no, it's been actually very welcomed. People recognize that. But it's also a very confusing issue in the sense that there's a great deal of heterogeneity in our economies. There are some sectors that have been, without doubt, hit really hard by competition, particularly from Asia. You see it in Brazil, you see it in Chile, you see it in Colombia. There's just no question. So then they say, well, what are we talking about competition? These areas are being hammered. And the answer is, yes, that's true, particularly traditional manufacturing, and that's part of what Elena just pointed to with the reduction in labor force participation in manufacturers. It's automation, and it's that competition. But then you have large parts of the economy which are less tradable, which are pretty concentrated still, and people know that they're big gorillas that have a lot of influence. So the overall, there's desire to pursue both agendas, I think.
Good. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah, there's one in the back first.
How you guys doing?
Hi.
I had one question. You mentioned the struggle with international competition. Do countries that engage in protectionist policy see more or less growth in terms of their local economy?
So the academic literature to date suggests that the more open you are, the faster you grow. That can be explained by access to technology. I mean, in static terms, we can all tell the standard stories we learn in school, but I think it's more the access to technology, the access to learning how to do things differently that are as important as the competition element per se. This said, this issue of learning, of how we get our firms to the frontier, right, is something that you see as an active agenda in the advanced countries in Asia as part of their development strategy. You look at Singapore, you look at Japan when they were in their high growth periods, huge amount of effort to get firms to the frontier. So they have agencies, Japanese Productivity Center, you have Spring in Singapore, which is basically meant to say, we want to be open, but we want to have our firms able to compete in that environment and able to interact with multinationals. And so we get diversified economies out of the whole thing. So both agendas we need to work on. We need to stay more open, and we need to work on how our industrial sectors, how our economies learn how they use new technologies, how they stay up with the frontier.
We have one in the back, and then we'll come to the front row.
Thank you. Alex Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in DC. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the CSIS Americas program. A question to Elena. I really like your comments about the large cities in Latin America. From what I understand, Latin America has 4 mega cities: Sao Paulo, Rio, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. I'm from Peru. I'm pretty sure Lima has to be in that list these days. Does your research Is there a forecast in your research about the rise of megacities across the region in the near future? Lima, Bogota, probably due to population growth, internal migration, regional migration, like the exodus of the Venezuelans to Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, and other countries. Are you recommending the mayors, the governors of these specific cities, how to prepare for the rise of the populations that they have to overlook? Thank you.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, that's a great question, because I didn't have a chance to discuss one aspect of the report. Actually makes projections going all the way to the end of this century. And we see that with the right investments in supporting the growth of network of cities, where strategically along routes of the network, of the transport network that connects the more populous and productive areas, you're going to see more growth in cities near coastal areas, where these current very large cities are. They will just merge or get much better connected with cities that are nearby. That's the kind of thing. These are the places where you're going to see rises in wages, in real wages, and more economic activity. The key is the management of these cities, because we also know, and I didn't have a chance to talk about the costs of agglomeration. We know that they're quite high in the region, and we know that the region benefits from the concentration of skills in cities, because people with education prefer to go to places with the most abundant amenities, and there is spillover effects that are very, very positive and very high. We showed this, my colleagues have shown this in research articles. However, they fail to benefit from density and from market access. And the density means that cities are not able to plan and execute the necessary policies to address bottlenecks as cities grow in size, that they will have to have better transport. They should integrate land management with the transport, encourage more the use of mass transport, and reduce congestion with better traffic management. They should also implement all sorts of issues to improve public services in a way, and affordable housing. This is a huge factor, because we know that many residents are sort of hesitant to move to places where they cannot find affordable and decent quality housing. So I think that the agenda on managing cities itself is huge in the region. Addressing fragmentation, and there are colleagues working just on the urban agenda. Professor Duranton in the University of Pennsylvania has written that they look more like cities in the region, look more like those in the past century. They're not ready. Just the structure of cities, when you look at it, is just they're structured with one central business district where everybody needs to go, and they're segmented and poorly connected. So then you have a gridlock, and that is something that they need to work on.
We have one question in the front.
Hi guys, thank you for your time and for the discussion. So pretty quick question. In these regions or cities with high rates of violence and organized crime, how can you encourage investors to really, set up shop there or invest in something that could stick around for 20, 30 plus years?
Right now, obviously, organized crime and the violence affiliated with it affects not just investors, it affects the entire society. So it's an issue we need to reduce, not only for business reasons, but just so our democracies stay solid and our societies remain livable. And the challenge we face as a region is high. If you look at homicide rates, we're about 5 times the homicides that we have in the United States, for instance, and we're about 10 times what they are in Asia. But that's not capturing the whole thing. The influence of organized crime is now showing up in Chile. It's showing up in Uruguay. We obviously had the tragedy in Ecuador 6 months ago, or almost a year ago now. And all that is revealing that these forces are much larger than we thought before, much more extensive. And they're also more global. It's not like there's a cartel, exporting cocaine from one part of Colombia, and no. These are international cartels, and it's all very intertwined. So the agenda there is how to deal with that, and that ranges from information sharing among security forces across the region, which we don't do enough right now, to things like judicial reform, police reform, prison reform. Right now, prisons are often not run by the state. They're run by the inmates. We need to regenerate some platforms that existed previously in the hemisphere, which have atrophied a little bit, so that there's a common platform with which security services can work. All that needs to happen. Otherwise, what you wind up with, I think, is the costs of security firms become high. I think there's a recent statistic, I think in the Financial Times, it's like 13% of firms in one country were paying almost 10% of their revenues in security. Okay, that's a lot of money. And you hear firms talking about that. So getting the security situation under control has to be part of this bid to become nearshoring destinations as well.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious about the Biden administration and the G7's Global Infrastructure Project, PG2, and to what extent that's played a role in the region.
Do you want to be more specific on that? What in particular?
I can find the name of it.
It's not the name, it's like, what element of the policy are you?
Oh, in terms of trade relations.
I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I don't have enough detail on it.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to end with sort of a big picture question that gets a little bit away from the focus of your research. But as you mentioned, Bill, some of the countries in the region that are drawing more investment are are the smaller countries, Costa Rica, Panama, Dominican Republic. And we see, there seems to be a little bit of divergence between some of the smaller countries in the region doing quite well and the largest countries in the region right now on track to sort of have the lowest economic growth this year. This question is for both of you. What can we draw from this, and are there things that the smaller countries in the region are doing well that we should be looking at? And I guess Uruguay belongs in that conversation as well.
Elena, do you want to take a shot at that, or you want me to?
I think you can go first, but I can add.
I would say there's a variety of approaches to the opportunities that the region is facing. The nearshoring is one opportunity. The green transition is another opportunity for the region, which we haven't talked a lot about, but which is getting a lot of attention throughout. Namely, we're a very green region. Most of our grid, 51% of our electricity is generated by renewables. If the Europeans get very serious about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, that potentially offers a new area of comparative advantage to the region. That effort is a little bit more uniform. You find all countries in the region interested in those kind of opportunities. I would say that what we're seeing is a lot of experimentation. There is honestly some frustration with the previous growth model across the region, and it's there. For 30, 40 years, we've been following the recipe, and Chile is growing at 2%. Right? 2% is not enough. It's just not enough. Other countries of comparable incomes are growing at 4%. So there's a lot of experimentation going on in different countries. Some countries, like Costa Rica, are being very aggressive, getting FDI in. Fabulous. The Chileans right now are doing some very interesting things on how to leverage lithium and how to leverage green hydrogen to diversify their economies through putting a lot more money into research and development and innovation and upskilling of their technical population, whatever you want, than they have in the past as another way of, as a modification of that model. Because I think we did underestimate the importance of managerial capital and technical human capital in previous discussions. So that we're seeing a lot of different experiments on which way to go. And some are you already see and you say, we've kind of tried some of these things before, they're not going to work. And others are, I think, have more of a chance. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would support and complement this answer, which was very, very good, that Bill provided, with an emphasis on the fact that whatever model countries choose and the policies that they will select will vary depending on their circumstances and their objectives. But in all of them, there is a need to boost a second engine of growth, not just rely on resources, because the big economies, they all are very well endowed with resources, and they're very important contributors to trade in agriculture and other natural resources. But what they're not utilizing fully is the skills and the labor of the workforce. Mm-hmm. And so that is, which is located in cities. So this is why I was discussing this two-pronged approach, that it needs to, this other engine of growth needs to kick in. Mm-hmm. And the two should be connected. We are talking about boosting cities doesn't mean ignoring rural areas. It just means that the cities need to seamlessly integrate with rural areas to transform natural wealth into jobs that are more productive and that benefit the population. If that fails, we'll see continued low growth, I guess.
On that note, I want to bring this to a close. I want to thank our speakers, Bill and Elena, for coming to Hudson Institute today. I think this has been a really informative and constructive conversation. I hope that your work gets into the right hands and that we can begin to see governments in the region really taking to heart some of the recommendations on competition and on strengthening cities. Thank you to our audience and thank you to everyone who's online today.
Thanks.